words about the historical setting in which formed the background to the Buddha's life and teaching, that which sort of led up to his appearance in the world and his career, if you would call it that. The religious and spiritual transition that was taking place around the time of the Buddha's life, which we call, or some historians have called the Axial Age. And then I'd like to really open it up to a discussion of the study questions, which I hope you all received, and to sort of consider together the Poison Arrow Sutra, which I think I also sent around or drew your attention to, just to summarize what I call the hot topics of the Buddha's time, you know, what people were thinking about and talking about and turning to teachers to learn more about. So that's the plan for the next 40 or 50 minutes or so. So I mentioned the Axial Age. This is spans the dates of about 800 to 200 BCE, before the Christian era. It was named the Axial Age by a German philosopher named Karl Jaspers, and he referred to it as an interregnum, or a period between two ages of great empire, a pause for liberty, like a deep breath bringing a more lucid consciousness. To the extent that the Axial Age, and by the way, I'm going to post my notes on the course forum, so don't feel like you have to write down every word. You'll actually be able to download these if you want. So it was a period where old certainties had lost their validity and new ones were still not ready. So in that sense, it's called a historically liminal period. Liminal just meaning it's like a threshold into a new period. So it's very much a transitional period in history. Its significance comes from the fact that it was taking place not just in one part of the world, but in really all the civilized areas of the world: Greece, China, India, and in the Middle East, the sort of Western Middle East or Mediterranean. So Jaspers, the German historian and philosopher, was particularly interested in the similarities in circumstances and thought of the Axial Age figures. This included an engagement in the quest for human meaning and the rise of a new elite class of religious leaders and thinkers in those countries that I've mentioned. These three regions, particularly China, India, and the Occident, gave birth to and then institutionalized a tradition of traveling scholars who roamed from city to city to exchange ideas. And this is very relevant, as we'll see, to the Buddha's time and his method of teaching. So the religious traditions that came about or contributed to this period of time in China were Confucianism and Taoism. In India, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. In Persia, the religion of Zoroaster, and the development of Judaism in Canaan. And in Greece, we had philosophers arising in the Socratic tradition primarily. So, also that Jaspers also pointed out that these characteristics appeared under similar political conditions. But in China, India, and in the Western Middle East, you have a situation of many small states engaged in both internal and external struggles. So there's not a big centralized government, but rather several small states existing. Okay, so just to summarize some features of the Axial Age. There was a thirst for discovering fundamental principles of existence and the implications that they had on human life and behavior. A major breakthrough from the age preceding this axial age involved a recognition of a great chasm between the transcendental or cosmic order and ordinary human existence, which I take to mean that prior to the axial age, there was much more of a religious practice would have involved worship of nature, sort of a kind of pantheistic or pagan type of practice. And we're coming into the axial age of humanity really sort of becoming more self-conscious and more aware of philosophical questions regarding, what's out there versus what's in here. In China, many individual thinkers such as Confucius and Lao Tzu began to reflect on the ethical and metaphysical implications of human existence. And as I said, from their teachings arose Confucianism, Taoism, and Jainism in India. In India, the authors of the Upanishads, and we'll talk about those later, expanded their scope of their explorations to include metaphysical thinking in the search for ultimate truth and the meaning of life and death. India experienced a dramatic socio-political and intellectual transformation, producing the teachings of the Buddha and Mahavira, who was the founder of the Jain religion. In Palestine, the prophets Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Deutero-Isaiah made their appearance. The law and the moral code of the Israelites dates back to even before this age. In Greece, developments, as I said, were more philosophical than religious. Now, I just wanted to, is anybody familiar with this wonderful book by Karen Armstrong, The Buddha? It's a really, really nice summary of the Buddha's life and of the axial age and the conditions that led up. She says about it that the axial age marks the beginning of humanity as we now know it. Really, we see the beginnings of monotheism in countries like Iran in the more western areas of the Middle East. And Greek rationalism, the beginnings of really the rationalist tradition with the Greek philosophers. So you can get a sense that this was really a very significant time in human history. Because we also don't know what caused it, nor why it took root in only 3 core areas: China, India, and Iran, and in the Eastern Mediterranean. She also says, in the axial countries, a few men sensed fresh possibilities and broke away from the old traditions. They sought change in the deepest reaches of their beings, looked for greater inwardness in their spiritual lives. So, that just gives you a flavor of her insight into this. Now, just a few words about what went before the axial age, which we call, in India specifically, because that's what we're focusing on. So in India, in the period leading up to the axial age, we have what's called the Vedic culture. And that began from around 1700 BCE to about 500 BCE. So that's coming up to right around the time of the Buddha. Vedic culture began with invasions into the Indian subcontinent by what were called Indo-Europeans. They rode horses and they used horse-pulled chariots for their warfare. They brought with them a pantheon of gods, including Indra, Varuna, Rudra, parallel to the Greek pantheon, and many of which survived for years into the Hindu religion. They also brought a threefold division of society into 3 classes: the priestly class, the warrior class, and cultivators, or the agricultural class. And again, this evolved into the caste system that India maintained for years and years. They also brought with them a drug called soma, which they took to induce ecstatic trances. And in these trances, they wrote hymns and poems, which were later named the Vedas. which was the beginning of a sacred scriptural tradition. You've maybe heard of the Rig Veda. That was composed apparently between 1500 and 900 BC. The Vedic culture, religious practice was seen as a search for power. So there was a priestly class which performed animal sacrifices and named things. And this class, you would sort of bring offerings or ask a priest to perform a sacrifice on your behalf in order to bring about some benefit. So this was the search for power through religious practice. So I mentioned before the Upanishads, the prose Upanishads. They were composed shortly before the time of the Buddha. And these were considered secret teachings, or the final stage in the evolution of the Veda, known as Vedanta. And you may have heard Vedanta, it still survives. And Vedanta is basically the philosophical underpinnings of the Hindu religion. So it's more philosophy than a religion in that sense. But the religion of the Vedas and the Upanishads became associated with social orthodoxy and with the growing centralized governments of the day. The Upanishads are known as the actual vehicle to attaining the Enlightenment, whereas the Vedas are held as the true foundation of the Hindu faith. The Upanishads are the vehicle to attaining the enlightenment or the release from samsara, or from suffering. The name Upanishad means a drawing near to the guru, so it was this sense of if you really want to go further in your religious development, if you really want to achieve liberation from suffering and samsara, you follow the Upanishad, the Vedanta. One of the beliefs in Vedanta, which was shocking at the time, which was kind of a new idea, was a teaching of rebirth and transmigration of the soul or the self. And there was a search for one that lay behind the cosmos in order to gain control and freedom from this cycle of repeated birth and death. So this is a very old tradition that, as we know, sort of accompanied the Buddha's life and his career and his teachings. So we see that those assumptions permeating early Buddhism as well. They held Brahman as the essence of the cosmos, particularly, I suppose, the external cosmos or ultimate reality, versus Atman, which is the essence of internal consciousness or self. But the Upanishads try to teach and demonstrate that these are actually one and the same, and that by contemplating on this unity, we're led to insight and ultimate liberation from suffering. I hope you all got a chance to look at the little map that I posted or emailed around, just to get a sense of where it was that the Buddha lived and taught. That whole Ganges River basin in sort of upper northeastern India. Did you have a chance to look at that? This was colonized by around 600 BCE when Iron Age technology came about. And with this technology, they were able to, warfare was facilitated by the development of weapons, but also iron plows allowed for an increase in development in agriculture. And with this in turn led to a larger government and religious institutions. So these are some of the social changes and philosophical changes that were coming about as the Buddha came into the world. Any questions about that so far? Yeah.
I wondered what anyone thinks about at some level then this increase in people's technological development. I mean, my turn went, yay, we can clap more efficiently, but it's kind of like what Master was talking about before. It's like
Yes, indeed, yes, cause and effect, and the interconnectedness of, and we still experience this in our present day world, right? With like nuclear power can be used for good or for evil, and these questions and these quandaries are still with us. Yeah, they have the same issues back then, indeed. Anyone else want to say anything about it? Okay. So we end up with, in this sort of culmination or flowering of the Vedic culture, we end up with a Brahmanic religion, Brahman versus another new movement, which was the Sramana philosophy. Again, this we'll see giving rise to the Buddha's homelessness or renunciate tradition. Indian philosophy consists of this Sramanic, which means self-reliant traditions. A bhakti tradition, which is characterized by worship of deities, and Vedic ritualistic nature worship. These coexist and influence each other at this time. The Sramanas held a view of samsara as full of suffering, dukkha, and they practiced ahimsa, which is nonviolence, and rigorous asceticism. They believed in karma, cause and effect, and moksha, which is liberation, and viewed rebirth as undesirable. Vedics, on the contrary, believed in the efficacy of rituals and sacrifices performed by a privileged group of people who could improve their life by pleasing certain gods. The Sramanic ideal of mendicancy and renunciation, and that the worldly life is full of suffering, and that emancipation requires abandoning desires and withdrawal into a solitary, contemplative life. The Sramanic philosophy, that is in stark contrast with the Brahmanical ideal of an active and ritually punctuated life. So traditional Vedic life holds that a man is born with an obligation to study the Vedas, to procreate and rear male children, and to perform sacrifices. Only in his later life may he meditate on the mysteries of life. So everybody was expected to live this way, to fulfill your social obligations. You weren't called to any kind of higher spiritual practice until maybe later in life, if you managed to live that long. The idea of devoting one's whole life to mendicancy seems to disparage the whole process of Vedic social life and obligations. Because the Sramanas rejected the Vedas, the Vedics labeled their philosophy as Nastika Darsana, or heterodox, which just means a breakaway. So beliefs and concepts of Sramana philosophies, this is our bullet list, is a denial of the creator and omnipotent God or gods, rejection of the Vedas as revealed sacred texts, affirmation of karma and rebirth, samsara and transmigration of soul, an affirmation of the attainment of moksha or liberation through nonviolence, renunciation, and austerities, a denial of the efficacy of sacrifices and rituals for purification, and a rejection of the caste system. So ultimately, the Sramana philosophical concepts like nonviolence, karma, reincarnation, renunciation, samsara, and release were accepted and incorporated by the Brahmins in their beliefs and practices. For instance, they eventually gave up the sacrifice of animals. Okay. And the two main schools of Sramana philosophy that have continued since ancient times in India are Buddhism and Jainism. Right, well, I would like to open it up to a discussion now. I did give you 3 study questions, which I hope everybody managed to see and give some thought to. just by way of even reviewing what I just talked to you about. So what do we mean by the axial age? Why do you think it's called the axial age? And one?
Because it goes from one way of living to the next, sort of transcends into something completely different.
Yeah. What's the meaning of axial? What is that word that comes from? Pivotal or an axis is something that turns. Yeah, so it's a pivot or an axis upon which something is turning from one state to another. Yes, Jay.
I was struck by the historical significance of the whole axial age. I'd never realized it before.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you just quoted an authority as saying that there's really not a reason why it developed in the same time period throughout all of the civilized world.
Mm-hmm.
But I was curious if they had any thoughts as to what happened when there was interaction between these divergent cultures all going through the same thing.
That's a really good question, and I really don't know the answer to it, but it would be an interesting point to research on your own and share with us if you would like to do that next time. Yes.
I don't think there was a lot of
Well,
interaction.
yeah, I read the same thing, that's why it was so interesting, because they all came up at the same time,
Independently.
but there wasn't very much interaction at that time just because of the
Right.
I think it's a
geography.
common evolution of the human spirit or soul. So in one area, multiple areas of the world, people evolve at the same time, and then also like the Iron Age,
Yes.
that had impacts on it as well.
Right. And that apparently that technology was appearing in more than one
Right.
place at a time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Any other thoughts or comments on the axial age?
It does make it all the more interesting though when you put yourself back in that time, because now with our technology and television and phone, we can find out all this information, but back then there wasn't any
Yeah.
way of communicating.
Mm-hmm.
But then all this, I mean, it is an amazing point you brought up, that all this was occurring around the same time without any knowledge. It's really amazing.
Yeah. And of course, with the hindsight of history, we're able to sort of recognize it more easily probably than people living through those times, because obviously the ancient Jewish prophets were not familiar with Buddha or, Zoroaster, so they were all kind of operating more or less in isolation, obviously.
Right.
They didn't know they were living in a nice
Right.
axial age.
No. We just called it that later.
That's right, we called it that later. It's a concept pointing towards another reality. Back to the Diamond Sutra, their obsession. Okay, second study question was, how do Shakyamuni Buddha and his unique teachings fit into the axial age paradigm? That is, how did the Buddha reform or reverse the previous orthodoxy? So how does he fit in, from what you know about him so far? How does he fit into this revolutionary age?
He sort of helped it fade away and go into something sort of more mainstream or steady, I guess.
Okay, I see what you're getting at,
Yeah.
yes. I guess what I'm thinking of is how did he, which of his teachings, you may not, we really haven't talked about the Buddha's teachings too much yet, but from what you know about the Buddha in his life, anybody, I'm sure somebody do, in what way did he go against, say, that Vedic Brahmanical tradition?
He rejected all the ritual and all that.
Yeah.
Of the Vedic tradition.
Right. Rituals and views, he definitely warned against those, yes. Renunciation, yes.
More a caste system.
Yes, he had a very egalitarian view of people. Yes.
It would just feel like all of his teachings to transcend frustration. All of
Yes,
it.
the idea of suffering, and the escape from suffering or the release from suffering was obviously a key part of his teaching.
But the Sramana tradition was there too, right?
Yes, he The Buddha, as we'll get into more next time, when we get into his actual life, his biography, his way of teaching, he was a wanderer. He was a wandering teacher, and before he began his own teaching career, he was studying with other teachers, and practicing austerities, and he was a student of other teachers.
Didn't it, I forget where I last read this, but in one of the iterations of after his enlightenment, he says like, I didn't really do this, on my own. It's not like I'm sort of some special person. I went to very methodically. I think somebody that if you exceptionally focused and driven to accomplish this goal, having had that kind of what we might today call a sort of feeling like soul sickness, or like, what is this doing? I really got to go find the answer, and very methodically learn from teacher to teacher to teacher, and learn everything, and then finding out that at the end of each teacher that they could only get him part of the way there. Sort of have that little death, and then the next one, going and going, so that his enlightenment stood on the shoulders of all of these experiences.
Yeah.
People.
Right. Yes.
And he relentless life.
Yeah, he was human, and he was dedicated and devoted, and he had to work to achieve what he achieved. Heidi, you were going to say something?
He kind of took the two previous, the Vedic and the Sramana. They were two extremes. One was almost, the Vedic was almost hedonistic in the sense of looking for power and of the offerings, and then the Sramana was the opposite extreme, where they were extreme mendicants in renunciation, aesthetics, and he kind of, middle way. I mean,
Exactly.
He went, okay, that's too much, and that's too much, and he took and formed it into something that was more powerful.
Yes, and also, yes, I think it's something more achievable, like not everybody will be inclined to go out and torture themselves in a very, severe ascetic tradition. Yes, he found that that's not the answer, and that we don't have to do that, and that there is this middle way. That's a really important point, yes.
He rejected the notion of the Atman as permanent, unchanging
Yes,
self.
I think that was an important change that the Buddha brought, that the self is an illusion, and that idea of Atman, which came through the Vedic tradition, and the Brahmanic tradition, is really, not a concept that we want to focus on or use, that it's misleading. Yeah, it's an important point too. The idea of God, that sort of rejection of Creator God, that's something that he carried on. Not a rejection, he just didn't want to deal with it. And that leads us to the Poison Arrow Sutra. Did everybody have a chance to look at that? This, I think, is a nice sort of segue into our continuing discussions next time, from the sort of hot topics of his day and the Buddha's sort of approach to them. What is a great little picture of one of his disciples coming to the Buddha and saying, why don't you teach me about this? I want to know about this, this, and this. And if you can't tell me about this, then I don't think I want to follow you. And so he's like, a little brat, isn't he? Malungya. So what are the questions that Malungya wanted to know about? The undeclared matters that he was hoping that the Buddha would teach. I have the copy in front of me, so I'll go over it. He says, he wants to know about whether the cosmos is eternal, or whether the cosmos is not eternal. The cosmos is finite, the cosmos is infinite. The soul and body are the same, or the soul is one thing and the body is another. After death, a Tathagata exists. Is everybody familiar with the term Tathagata?
Isn't that a higher level spirituality in some sort?
It's really synonymous with the Buddha. we refer to the Buddha as Buddha, but he wouldn't have referred to himself as a Buddha, but the Tathagata, yes, is an awakened being, full accomplishment. So the name means sort of suchness, or coming from nowhere and going nowhere is the idea, sort of, yeah, that's the Tathagata. So that's an expression that this would have been common before the Buddha didn't invent that expression. So does the Tathagata exist after death or not, or does and doesn't exist? So these are some of the questions that Malunkia wanted to know from the Buddha. And what was the Buddha's response?
That those questions weren't relevant to becoming enlightened.
Yeah, he says they're not related to the holy life. And what was the sort of parable that or the metaphor that he used? The poison arrow, remember that? He says, it's just as if a man were wounded with an arrow thickly smeared with poison. Yeah, before he lets the doctor to pull the arrow out, he wants to know what kind of wood is it made of, or what kind of feathers are in it, all these really irrelevant questions that, if answered, would cost him his life. So it's a very vivid example, isn't it, of what we need to know, what we don't need to know, and sort of how we stay focused on the path and not get sidetracked by irrelevant issues. Does that make sense to everybody? Does anybody have questions or comments about that?
It just seems very practical.
It is very practical.
We're going to do every day. You know, live in a more peaceful life.
Yes.
Right, all these other questions are just your mind.
Yes. Yes.
Man, still, I ask those questions, oh, where did I come from? Those have always been questions that
Yeah.
people, why was that? I understand the significance of saying if it's about the arrow, but why wouldn't he answer it anyway?
Why wouldn't he answer?
Yeah, why was it irrelevant?
Because he said, I'm here to teach about suffering and the release from suffering. I think that was just the mission that he took. And that was how he felt that people could best be helped and saved. Yes, Don?
In another sutta, Malankayaputta, the Buddha referred to the idea that anything that he would say on the subject would lead people to question more, to analyze every word that he said, and in such a way they would spend so much time debating these terms that they would not have time to practice. And so therefore, instead of practicing the path to freeing themselves from suffering, they would do the opposite. And they would spend more and more time debating and debating, and this would lead to more suffering. So therefore, he said he would leave it undeclared. What I have left undeclared, leave undeclared, and what I have declared, leave declared. What have I declared? There is suffering in the world. There's a cause of suffering in the world. There is a cessation of suffering, and there's a path of practice leading to the cessation of suffering. That is all that I have declared.
Thank you so much.
Ananda probably did it better.
You're the best second. Does that make sense? I mean, have we not all belonged to like organizations where debates go on and on and on until you never get anything done? It's, maybe those questions are worth thinking about, reading about, but, I think it's a question of setting priorities. And I think the Buddha was trying to just show us, here's where to focus your energies if you want the best results. And in your spare time, you might wonder about these other things, but you might, the answers are not as certain.
And if your practice evolves, maybe
Maybe
you don't have
come
those
to know
questions.
those questions.
Or,
even
yeah,
more.
exactly, or
Yes.
it's going to change, so, yeah.
Indeed.
It's like those questions are external questions, looking for truth. And back to whatever,
Yeah.
external from yourself.
Mhm.
So,
That's right, you can't, you won't, well, you might discover them through an internal contemplation or
Right.
meditative practice,
Right.
eventually.
right,
Yeah.
it's like you're looking for the answer before you figure out how to find it. or
Plus,
whatever.
maybe they're concepts like the Diamond Sutra talks about anyways.
Yes,
Yeah.
right. Right. Yes, Tracy?
I was just gonna say that Poison Arrow Sutra is so valuable. I'm in private practice, for anyone who doesn't know, and for some of my kids and parents who are okay with me going into Buddhism, who, in our culture, we so often are the, why did this happen? You know, rather than, okay, this happened, what can I do now? Just, you know, just how that arrow is. So a lot of my clients are stuck. You know, why did my dad die? My dad shouldn't have died. Why? And that's okay in the beginning. You know, those are all, that's how you feel. But when I've related this sutra to them, specifically talking about, well, what's the most important thing for this man to get help? Or for this man to have sex? You can see it click. And they're like, oh, okay. So I'm sad and I'm thinking these why questions, but maybe a more important question is, what can I do right now to take care of myself, to be able to live with it? Do you know what I mean? It's really a powerful sutta when you can put it into your life now, because I think a lot of us are why people. Why is it so hot outside?
Yeah.
You know? So I mean, it's interesting in the eyes of children how they get it, you know, when you use that particular sutta. So I mean, I really recommend it. I use it quite a bit. And sometimes with my kids who are from more Christian families, I just use it more as a, once upon a time, there was, you know, and they get it, because while I'm talking, they interrupt me and say, why is that guy asking all those questions?
Yeah.
He needs to go to the doctor. You know, I mean, they get it.
In my own personal life, because I used to ask why all the time, even from being a young child to now. And when I stopped asking why, I realized that I was looking for an answer that just was irrelevant. It didn't really exist. I mean, what is the point in knowing what color an arrow is when it's sticking in your back or when it's made out of? And that's the ego, though, wanting to control a situation that's not controllable, and that's life.
Kathy?
Any word, any answer has to be expressed in words or some sort of language. So we will be, you know, if the Buddha gave any answer in words, then it's going to lead us into conceptualization. And we don't understand. Our faculty won't allow us to understand.
Maybe some of those like kind of questions like that, like words can't even explain, you know, like our minds can't even grasp them. Right? And I think pondering some of those things could negatively affect some people. In a way, like they might go crazy just thinking about these things. And they waste a lot of time when they could be using that time to get enlightened. You know?
Right. Any other questions or comments? Okay, well, I'm finished.